Well, I think we'll make a start. It's 2 minutes past. We'll continue to let people in. Thanks to Amy, who's admitting people. So I'm Liz Carnelley, and I work for Near Neighbours. This is in part of our Near Neighbours series of webinars so that people from different parts of the country can come together to share wisdom and learn from one another, and also learn from our speakers. And today I'm really glad to have with me Ali Amla, who's an old friend of Near Neighbours over many years and of mine. And I'm really grateful that he's joined us today, especially since he's joining us all the way from Cyprus. And he's going to introduce himself shortly to you all in a moment. Near Neighbours brings together people from different backgrounds and faiths. And this session will focus quite a bit on how we have difficult conversations with people of different faiths and backgrounds. But having said that, the principles that apply to any kind of difficult conversations.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock in Cyprus. So good afternoon from Cyprus. Fingers crossed the Wi-Fi will hold out and we're going to be able to facilitate a conversation on having difficult conversations as well. As is often the case, I want to begin by creating a safe space. And that's really important because we want this to be a safe space for everybody to contribute, particularly for me and Liz as facilitators and contributors as well. So we're going to begin with a small exercise, which is going to look at how would you like to create a safe space, followed by doing a quick introduction to and asking you to contribute to your expectations for the next 90 minutes. And then we're going to introduce what we are going to realistically cover during the next 90 minutes as well. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to attempt to use Mentimeter, something I've not done whilst I've been abroad. So fingers crossed this will work. So if you've got your phones handy, if you'd like to use your camera to use that to take you onto the Menti link, or you can go to menti.com and type in 17609730, and it will immediately ask you the first question, which is how would you create a safe and courageous space for dialogue? Right, fingers crossed you can begin to see that. As I mentioned in the introduction, creating and crafting the safe space for dialogue is really important. In order for you to be involved in this conversation and feeling safe to have this conversation and dialogue, but also as a facilitator, ensuring your participants feel that they have a space that they can contribute into as well and feel comfortable in contributing, particularly if there's an aim or intention to have difficult dialogue. So again, I think what's coming up time and time again is that real need for respect, that mutual trust, being able to be a space for active listening. And I often use and quote Stephen Covey, listening to understand rather than listening to respond. There's a lot there. I would also add, when I'm facilitating Chatham House rules, and that, just to explain Chatham House rules, it's a level of confidentiality where you don't ascribe what somebody has said. However, it's not so confidential that you can't share the learning from the session itself. So what we want you to do is we want you to take away, share the learning with others. What we don't want you to do is, oh, did you hear what Amy said about X, Y, and Z? Or did you hear what Liz said about X, Y, and Z? Because then that would be breaking Chatham House rules, but it means that you're also sharing personal experiences that were shared in that safe space as a way of respectfully listening to what's being said as well. I'm going to move on to the next question, and hopefully this will automatically take you on to the next question, which is, what are your expectations from today's session? I think the first one's really important. As a facilitator, having the confidence to facilitate. And the reality is, what Liz and I will be speaking to you about today isn't a magic formula to be the most amazing facilitator for difficult conversations. These are some of the key skills, approaches we've learned over the years, but also it's an opportunity for you to share the great work you're doing in creating spaces for difficult dialogue as well. And hopefully that will be reassuring for you and therefore allow you to have some confidence in your own skills as facilitators. Yes, we're definitely going to do some improving of understanding, learning how to handle difference. I often speak about the Brexit effect, particularly which is at this moment feeding into binary thinking, and the challenge of how do we negotiate or create spaces that allow difference to be shared without the need to reconcile that difference, or without a need just to say, or with a need to accept that those different opinions exist without feeling that they have to be agreed upon. Strategy, there's a little bit of that. Honesty, yes, lots of that today. Bucket loads. Okay, I think just quickly flicking through what's been written, seems like what most people have written is definitely what we are going to be introducing very broadly. Brilliant, excellent. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you. So we've done a quick introduction, and feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat function as to who you are, where you're joining us from today as well. And we're going to be doing a quick exercise and a short exercise on introducing facilitation. We are going to be sharing a number of tips and tools. We're going to be sharing both mine and Liz's experiences and your experiences of facilitation, and what does a good facilitator look like as well. And then I'm going to do a quick, brief introduction to interfaith dialogue and some of the difficult dialogue approaches I've taken, particularly on the area I specialize in, is on facilitating dialogue and education on Israel-Palestine. And I'm going to speak a little bit about solutions, not sides, and our very unique pedagogical model as well. Next slide.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to take over now from Ali. And we've talked a bit about how we create a safe space here. And we've asked you for thoughts that you've shared with us on things that create a safe space, things like respect and listening and honesty and so on and so forth. What I want to say to you is that creating a safe space is about how you make people feel. People feel safe or they don't feel safe. People feel able to share or they don't feel able to share. People feel able to listen or they don't feel able to listen. And the skills and techniques about facilitating a good conversation and a group and a place where people can actively participate relate to making people feel certain things. So, for example, timekeeping is important in facilitating a group. The reason it's important is it values people. People feel valued. Their time is valuable. They are valuable. So I'm going to ask you to split into groups of 4. Amy's going to do all the technical things that make that happen. I want you to think about some time when you were involved in some kind of group discussion or facilitated group, something that worked really, really well in that time, and how it made you feel, because that is actually how you know it's worked well, because it made you feel something. You felt valued, you felt listened to, you felt appreciated, you felt respected, whatever it is. So think of a time you were involved in some sort of facilitation that worked well, and identify what was it that made it work well, timekeeping, very clear ground rules, whatever it was, and how that made you then feel safe, included, valued, etc. Is that everybody clear with that? If you're not clear, you could just put something in the chat that says, I don't understand, and we can go into your group and explain. Hopefully that's clear. I'm going to give you about 15 minutes for this exercise. If you don't want to take part, don't join the group. We've got a lot of people in this session, so we're splitting down into 4 groups of 4 so that you've got a chance to share this. And then we're going to bring everybody back. I'm not going to go around the groups and ask you to explain. but I am going to ask you to write in the chat something that made facilitation work well for you, e.g. timekeeping.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody rejoining. I hope it was a helpful time in your group. Please mute yourself now, and if you want to turn your camera off, feel free. What I'd like you to do is to put in the chat a one-word answer will do, something that you identified as something helpful in facilitating good conversations, like timekeeping. So if you could just put that in the chat, that'd be great, and I'll refer to that in a moment. But I'm going to say that ground rules are the number one thing that's really, really important. You need to agree at the beginning of any kind of discussion like this what the ground rules are. And there are different ways of doing this. One way, for example, is to say, here are the ground rules. These are the ground rules of our organization, or these are the ground rules that I always use, or whatever it is. And here they are, and go through them and say, you've all got to respect each other, you've all got to listen to each other, or whatever it is. A better way, in my opinion, if you've got time, is to get them to say what they want the ground rules to be. And then there's more chance of them actually owning them, living up to them and following them. So, for example, we agree all to listen to each other. We all agree that we're going to keep everything in this space confidential. We're not going to judge each other, that kind of thing. And if people actually come forward with those ground rules themselves, in my opinion, it's helpful, because if you then get into a tricky discussion, you can remind people, remember what we said. We said we'd really listen and respect each other. So can we just make sure that's what we're doing? And if they've all agreed to that at the beginning, it's much easier to kind of bring people back. So I think it's really important, as Ali did at the beginning of this session when he talked about Chatham House, is to establish what are the ground rules. It's probably also really helpful to say, what do we expect to get from this? And I would say it's not normally that we're all going to agree with each other, because actually that's probably impossible. And what you actually want is something rather different. Perhaps what we'd like to do is really hear each other, or what we'd like to do is come up with a plan that we're all happy with, or something along those lines. At this point, I just want to say that there is a really helpful, free, downloadable resource that Near Neighbours have produced, which is about helping people to have discussions and facilitated conversations. And Amy will share this at the end of the session, and we'll also send it around afterwards. But that gives lots of really helpful tools and techniques, because we have a program called Real People Honest Talk in Near Neighbours, and it was written with that in mind, to help people who are facilitating those real people honest talk discussions. There's a lot more detail in those than I'm going to have now. So I've talked about ground rules. Another important thing is icebreakers. Icebreakers are really important because if people don't know each other, they do need a soft way of getting to know one another. And you can use different kinds of icebreakers depending on the size of your group, how well they know each other already, how well they don't know. If there's some people who don't speak much English, for example, these are all things that you'll need to consider. For example, if people really don't know each other at all, then a very non-threatening icebreaker is to be in twos and to say to people, tell the person what your name is in your pair, and then tell them the story of your name. How did you get that name? What does it mean? Is it important in your family or your faith or your culture or whatever? If you've got a group where people know each other a bit, but perhaps not very well, another icebreaker is find 3 things in common. For example, this group of 3, we've all been on holiday to Cyprus, like Ali Amla, or we all live in Walsall, or whatever it is. That's just going a little bit deeper. You have to think about what's not going to be threatening, because some people will find different things threatening. For a lot of people, sitting around in a circle and sharing things is actually really threatening and difficult and intense, and they don't really like that. So what you need to do is think about how to include and value everybody and help them to contribute. So, for example, have a kind of menu of things that you're going to do to help people. So, for example, do you have the facility to get lots of people writing things on post-it notes? Some people find that a lot easier than saying things out loud, and then you can collect them in and read them out for people. You might find that you need to have some newspaper cuttings and people are going to pick them up and say, oh, I really like this one, I don't like that one. Some creative people will do things like, we're all going to make a box and draw on it, and I've got loads of paints, and you know, it's going to symbolize, I don't know, what we need to change in our community. Some people like that kind of creative thing. So finding out a bit about the group and what they're going to like, and what they're going to find difficult, that's going to be it's really important, because this is not a science, it's a skill, and it's one you learn with practice. And I would say, you know, try facilitating before you get into a difficult conversation. Do some low level facilitating first to get people talking. Icebreaker bingo, somebody's just said, is a good way. You have a sheet, find somebody in the room who's been abroad, find somebody who can play the musical instrument, find someone who could speak a foreign language. It is a good way, if people don't mind going around and asking people random questions. Another important thing is timekeeping and drift. You don't want people to be drifting off into irrelevant things. If you've got certain things that you need to discuss, then somebody who keeps going on about the post office is just going to take people in a different direction. Or somebody who always wants to talk about why buses are always late is going to take people in a different direction. So you need to keep bringing people back. But also, as I said before, timekeeping is valuing what people are giving to this. It's valuing them and their valuable time. So saying, right, I think we've had enough on that, let's move on to this, and let's keep it on track, keep it going, is sometimes important if there's an actual thing that you need to get out of your group. Another important thing is energy, pace. You can tell in a room if people are drooping, if they're dropping, if they've lost interest, if they've lost energy. And you need to energize people yourself if you're the facilitator. And you can do that by changing the pace, changing the topic, moving on to something else, getting people to get up, move about. Another thing that some people like to do is, you know, spread yourself across a room with an opinion. So, for example, if you think pineapple on pizza is a great idea, stand at that corner. If you think it's the worst thing ever, stand in this corner. And if you're not sure, stand in the middle. You then get onto more difficult topics. Do you think Brexit was a good idea or not? Stand at that end, stand, or if you're not sure, in the middle. Do you think people should be allowed to be gay? You know, you can move on to quite difficult things once you've established that as a way of doing it. And then you can ask people in the line, you know, why did you choose to stand here? Why did you choose to stand there? And if people don't want to say, they don't make them. It's only if people want to express their thoughts and opinion. So shaking up the learning styles is really important. Shaking up the kind of way you're doing it is going to be important for involving everyone. But you won't know that till you get going and you know how people are getting involved and engaged. So, for example, if you find that in your big group, there's 3 people who've not said a word since it started, then obviously they're not comfortable. They're not sharing. They're not engaging. Try something different. You know, let's all get into twos. Let's write down on a piece of paper. Let's go and put a post-it note on this side of this room of something that you think is really important that you'd like to raise. And then they don't have to actually say it themselves, or they don't have to speak to the whole group. Dealing with difficult people. So there are different things that you can do to deal with strong feelings, difficult feelings, aggression, dominance. And in my opinion, it's best if you've already thought of a menu of things that you're going to do. For example, draw people back to the ground rules. You know, you said at the beginning, we're going to be respectful and we're going to listen. I just remind everybody of that. You might say, okay, you've expressed some really, really strong feelings there about the post office and why you're not getting your letters, but I think we're going to move on now to talk about If you feel what the person said really needs to be challenged or addressed, either you can do that or ask the group to. So you might say, does anybody want to respond to that very strong point of view. If people are saying things or are likely to say things that are actually quite difficult to hear, and remember there's a sort of tension between people being honest, other people feeling comfortable, a safe space, a space where people express what they're feeling. There's tension there. So what some people will do is they tell the group beforehand, if you feel uncomfortable with something somebody says, you should say ouch, or hold up a sticker that says ouch, or a color that says ouch, meaning that hurt me. What you said, I felt quite challenged by or quite hurt by. If somebody misspeaks or says something that they regret or thinks, oh, perhaps I shouldn't have said that, they can say oops. So ouch, oops is a way of helping people to deal with their difficult feelings, but in a very non-threatening way. It's quite often better to deal with it there and then than let it fester on for the rest of the session. So, for example, somebody might say, I don't know, all gay people, and somebody might say, oof, that's a bit much to say that. And then, oh, oops, sorry, I shouldn't have said that. What I meant to say was. So sometimes it can be dealt with quite quickly and people can move on with it. There's another sort of version of that, which is people can say, whoa, if they hear something that they feel is a bit strong or a bit too much, but they don't feel personally affected by. So there are variations on that. But if you're going to be leading a discussion, you feel that there's going to be some very difficult things shared, then perhaps that's something you could do beforehand to help people to deal with that as it goes along. Another way of dealing with somebody difficult or somebody who talks all the time or is very dominant is just to say, okay, let's hear from someone else who hasn't spoken yet. Or I think you've said a lot now, Brian, or whatever, you know, perhaps we'll let Shamira speak now. Or simply break them up into groups. Say, right, now we're going to break up into threes and we're going to discuss this, because then the person who's trying to be dominant can't dominate every group. At the end of the day, though, if someone is very, very disruptive or aggressive, then they simply have to be asked to leave, and have been in places where that's happened. But it's, you know, it is voluntary to be at something like this. If somebody doesn't want to be there or is very disruptive, then you might have to ask them to leave, or just take some time out. You know, perhaps you just like 5 minutes to sort of, you know, calm down, Brian, or whatever it is. Non-verbals, pick up non-verbals and see how people are speaking without speaking, if you know what I mean. Are they engaging? Are they looking sad? Are they looking bored? Does it look like they've all switched off? Do they look unhappy? You're going to have to use your skills of empathy there to sort of try and see. And you need to be listening well to other people as well. You need to be using all your skills to listen to the group, and whether that's verbal or body language, as it were. A ritual to end or an ending is really good, I think, in a kind of group session. For example, we're now going to check out with something that we all value from this today, or we're all going to write on a stone a word that symbolizes how we found today that's really positive, or, you know, we're going to pass around a balloon, and when you've got the balloon, say one word about how you felt today. It's good to check out and to end well, in my opinion. And then lastly, I'll just look through some of the comments that we've had and see if there's anything that I haven't picked up. Patience. Some people don't like the word icebreakers, and they talk about check-ins instead. Feeling valued makes you more confident to contribute. Yes, and you sometimes have to intervene yourself to help people make that contribution. You know, you might need to say, you know, Amy, you've not said a lot in this session. Is there anything you'd like to share? Feel free to intervene. That is your role as the facilitator. Facilitator means to make easy. So you're trying to make easy this discussion. And your goal isn't to get everybody to agree. Your goal is for everyone to be involved, included, and contribute. And making that safe space for people to be able to do that. As I say, it's not a science, it's a skill that you learn by doing, and you can only do it and get better at doing it. Like anything, like riding a bike, you've just got to get on and start, and go slow, perhaps go with a group that's not talking about Israel Palestine to begin with, but perhaps something quite low key, and you will get more confident as you do it. You will get more skilled as you do it. But I'll be honest, it's only by doing it that I think you actually learn how to do it better. I'm going to hand back to you now, Ali, and you can contribute all your learning and knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So yes, Liz mentioned one of the most challenging conversations to have, which is around the subject of Israel-Palestine. And I've written 2 blogs which might be of interest. One is titled The Elephant in the Interfaith Room, which highlights the challenge of talking about Israel-Palestine, particularly at an interfaith level. And then I've written a second blog published in December, which is titled Building Bridges in Times of War. And these 2 blogs really highlight the challenge we're currently facing on a society level of having dialogue around Israel-Palestine. And I must acknowledge not everybody is ready to have dialogue. And I think that's really important, that you can only have dialogue when you and the participants involved are ready to have that dialogue. So whilst I may say it is the elephant in the interfaith room, so acknowledging why people may not be ready to have that dialogue as well, and giving that space that's really required as well. And I'm not going to, in the next few minutes, provide any commentary of what's happening in the region. I'm going to speak very broadly, and that's just to reflect on my own experiences of facilitating dialogue. If we move on to the next slide. So for me, I'm going to talk very broadly about interfaith. And for me, interfaith is something which is at the heart of much of my work, but something that I love very much as well. So I often say there's 3 stages to interfaith, which is an entry level, intermediary, and advanced. When I say entry level, I often say, and I use the phrase very tongue-in-cheek, of going beyond tea and samosa interfaith. Or using food or breaking bread together as a way to foster good relations, as a way to break the ice, dare I use that phrase, and begin people to have that informal conversation. And again, something I've said quite often, which is sometimes interfaith has rarely gone beyond tea and samosa interfaith, or rarely gone beyond bagels and porgies. And it stays in that really nice, comfortable, warm, fuzzy space of having dialogue, which isn't difficult, which doesn't push the boundaries, but nevertheless is really important as a starting point. But as part of that entry level, I would say it's really important to use that opportunity to foster religious literacy as an opportunity for education and dialogue, and foster friendship and relationships as a really important foundation that you can then build upon. And when I speak about intermediary level interfaith or community relations, it's really important to think about local solutions around activism and around finding the common good, and working up towards social action and local cooperation. Then a more advanced level of deeper theological debate and discussion, or I would say dialogue rather than debate, navigating differences, but also utilizing those relationships within the political and social sphere, as well as leadership development as well. If you move on to the next stage, next slide, please. So when I'm facilitating dialogue, I begin, as we did today, in really crafting that, creating that safe space for courageous dialogue. Even when that's at the introductory level, it's, as Liz said, it's really important to hold that space, to actually identify how to create a space which is courageous and safe. What will allow us to intimately feel safe in this space, trust to be respected, to listen. And as Liz said, there's two ways to craft that space. One is to go in with a pre-existing ground rules, or the second approach is more of a creating a space where you create a shared learning agreement, which I personally prefer, as Liz said as well. And that can be really powerful in fostering that space. Some people are like, oh, want to jump straight into that really difficult dialogue. I often say, hold your horses, embrace the opportunity and build on the foundation. And for me, the next stage is really important in finding common ground. What are our similarities? And how do we create spaces to find similarities? And often when I speak about common ground, people will often come back at me and say, actually, why should we find our lowest common denominator? Actually, it's not about finding the lowest common denominator. We're actually creating a space where you can find shared stories, shared experiences, and that commonality can be really powerful as a foundation, as a next step in creating spaces for more difficult dialogue. Also then, that's a real space to start listening to difference and pulling and pushing and pulling and grappling with thoughts and ideas and beliefs. But then we're using that as a foundation to then start thinking about what does it mean to work towards a common good? How can we make the world a better place, as an example? Or how can we create a cause which improves society on a local micro level or a larger macro level as well? And then using that relationship that you're having with your foundation of the common ground, of spending time together through working towards a common good, to then having more difficult dialogue. And as Liz mentioned, there are varying different forms of difficult dialogues. And sometimes it's easier to practice with less controversial issues. And I often say it's really important to then build muscle memory for difficult dialogue. And particularly when talking about Israel-Palestine, I often say it's important to build muscle memory and build resilience of having difficult dialogue at times when it's less violent, rather than jumping into having a conversation or dialogue at times of heightened tensions, violence, and war. And I think that muscle memory is really important to build that resilience, because I think, particularly for right now, there is a real deep breakdown of empathy, a real breakdown in listening to how one another are feeling and acknowledging one another's pain as well. Next slide, please. So moving from the very broad approach to facilitating dialogue, I'm going to move towards some guidelines for fostering interfaith dialogue or dialogue on Israel-Palestine. And you'll see there's a lot of similarities in creating those spaces as well. To normal interfaith or community relations more broadly, it begins with that space for uncomfortable dialogue. The reason I include uncomfortable dialogue rather than courageous spaces there is it's acknowledging that the dialogue on Israel, we can acknowledge where potentially participants may experience emotional triggers as well. And then moving towards that foundation of that common ground, and then working towards learning to disagree respectfully and better. So having that space to listen to one another in a way that allows you to grapple, to share, to talk without taking offense. But also be able to create that space where you can challenge as well, and then also working towards the common good. And in the sense of Israel-Palestine, I often say that working towards a common good is contributing on a peace building level. It also means what can we do at a local level to foster good interfaith relations? And that working towards the common good can also mean standing together against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia as well. Next slide, please. So again, I'm not going to expect you to read what I've written here, but what I've kind of highlighted here is the importance of bringing in an experienced facilitator. If this is your first experience of facilitating difficult dialogue, I'd highly recommend don't use Israel-Palestine as a subject. Not one to begin with, definitely something that's really needed for more experienced facilitators. Some of you may be there already, and therefore, yes, please do. But again, just to highlight, it's really important to have a skilled facilitator that can navigate this space. Defining what it means, as we've done already, co-creating those shared ground rules, creating that space for sharing expectations. That's incredibly important generically, but also specifically as well. Also understanding, what do you want to gain from this dialogue? What is realistic and what is not? And I think that management of expectations of dialogue is probably one of the biggest challenges right now that we're facing on a community level. Again, why interfaith? Is this particular model of dialogue the most appropriate model to use? And also, why now? And I think that why now question is really important, because I think that's a conversation many of us don't have when we're having dialogue as well. Again, what are your motivations? Reflecting on your own individual motivations, but collective motivations. But also, how often do we create spaces where motivations for dialogue are shared openly and discussed openly as well? Defining boundaries and red lines, I think, are really important to ensure that you're openly able to talk about what you are going to talk about, but also what you're not going to talk about, or what you may not be ready to talk about as well. Particularly on the subject of Israel-Palestine, really important to introduce the subject area of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And how do we ensure that the line isn't crossed? And if the line is crossed, what do we do to mitigate the impact of it as well? And how do we create a space where we respectfully challenge when somebody crosses the line in a way that allows you to build relationships than destroy relationships? Explore collectively how you manage conflicts and disagreements or offense. And again, that can be different to crossing the line into anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. That can also include crossing that line as well. Also talk about power difference and the power dynamics within the group setting. What does that mean? I briefly touched upon emotional triggers during dialogue, which is really important. But also, as a facilitator, being aware of your own emotions. How does your emotions shape the dialogue that's currently happening and taking place? And again, what does it mean to talk about Israel-Palestine whilst not crossing the line into anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which is incredibly difficult and challenging as well. Next slide, please. So again, I've mentioned finding common ground. I'm going to go through the next few slides very quickly. For me, it's about teasing out that common ground. And you can use things like scriptural reasoning, etc., to highlight differences, but also a really important way to find that common ground, but also the historical narratives on Israel-Palestine, the theology, etc., which can be challenging, but also can allow you to find that common ground as well. Next slide, please. And as part of that finding common ground, finding that opportunity to think about conflict resolution skills and how that applies as well. Again, for me, the aim for any dialogue is around listening to diverse narratives rather than to reconcile or agree what's being said. And I think that's really important, particularly in managing that expectation. But also think about contested nature. We have contested histories when it comes to Israel-Palestine. How do we understand how they intersect and how they differ? Also really important to partner with organizations in the region so you can listen to the voices of Palestinian and Israeli peace builders and explore the impact the ongoing conflict has on Palestinians and Israelis as well. And looking at actually what cross-community dialogue is taking place in the region and what we can learn from their experiences as well. And I think that's really important. I'm going to stop there. I think I've got maybe 2 more slides to go, but I think I've just thrown everything, including the kitchen sink, at you. And I've just, put some suggestions and working towards the common good. But yeah, I think it's a good time to move on for questions.
I've got one here. Well, someone said they'd like to ask a question just now, actually, about language. and the ways different people are triggered by certain words and expressions. The person who asked that, do you want to clarify what the question is around language?
And
Yeah, sure.
I'm here from Ireland, so thank you very much for facilitating this. I can give an example if you don't mind, bearing in mind we're following the Chatham House rules, so it won't be taken outside, but I won't contextualize it. So I was once in a meeting where there was somebody from Palestine was making a presentation of some artwork he had been doing, and it was about the art really, and he became it was artwork that he'd created about his home in Gaza, and this was several years ago, and he began to talk about what the Jewish soldiers did, and they kept using the word Jewish. And there were several Jewish people in the room who walked out from the session. And so the whole session kind of fell apart. Now, that's an example of an occasion where Palestinians' understanding of when to use the word Jewish was completely different from the perception of the British-born Jewish people who felt deeply offended by this. So here in Ireland, you would have similar issues at stake where somebody, you might, how you define Northern Ireland, whether you call it Northern Ireland, whether you call it the North, this historically has been a really, really big thing. So I'm just wondering how you would work with the whole issue of language and whether you'd explore the fact that we'd use different terminologies for different things, or let it emerge as the attempts at dialogue go on. Thank you. I don't know if I've made myself clear.
Thank you. You have made yourself clear, but you've also, I think, highlighted the challenge in facilitating dialogue and the importance of knowing your audience and knowing the participants who are stepping into that space, which is often, in my personal opinion, much easier to do in physical spaces that you create and hold for dialogue rather than virtual spaces. Virtual spaces with 50 or 100 people, it's a lot more difficult to manage that space and be aware of who's in that room and the sensitivities on language. But having said that, I think sensitivity in language is really important. And I had a baptism of fire when I worked in Northern Ireland due to that, or the north of Ireland, as you said. And particularly, I became very accustomed to calling Derry, Derry, rather than Derry, Londonderry.
Oh, yeah.
And I got a lot many a time, and I very quickly learned that I have to call it both names in order not to upset one group or another. And therefore, I've learned over the last 10 years, or since I've worked in Northern Ireland, that whenever I'm there, or whenever when I'm back in England, to call it Derry, Londonderry, rather than just to call it Derry, as an example.
Well
and I
done.
think that's just
Congratulations.
consciously aware of the power of language. And again, and I don't want to make commentary on anything you've mentioned, but I think it's really important that you don't generalize about people, and you're much more specific in the language that you're using in order not to cause offense. And I think that navigation is constantly changing. The issue of language is always one, but also crafting the space where you can acknowledge that you may not get the language right every time, and therefore that space needing to be forgiving, but also a space where it's open enough where you can challenge as well. But personally, I do prefer physical spaces for dialogue with 5, 10, 15, 20 people over virtual. But and that maybe gives us an indication as my own approach. But again, virtual dialogue is much more harder. But webinar and more linear learning spaces like today, I think can really be powerful to disseminate knowledge and information as well. Liz, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just to say, I think it's one of those things which, if you know it's going to be coming up in a session you're running, And then you can talk about that in the beginning around the ground rules. So, for example, we will talk about Israelis and Palestinians. We won't talk about Jews and Muslims or Arabs or whatever it is you want to say. I think also Ali is really making a very important point that we don't all get it right all the time. And I think we've got to make allowances for one another. And that's the oops of the ouch that I was talking about earlier. And I think as well, it's important to, if you're talking about faiths and with people, then there's an organization called The Feast, thefeast.org.uk, and they do dialogue around teenagers around different faiths. And they have some guidelines for dialogue, which I think are quite helpful in faith conversations and faith discussions. One of which is, I can only speak about my own faith and the positives of my own faith and not anything about anyone else's faith, because it's important for me to just talk about my own experience, my own faith. And also that you can't judge a group by one person. So you can't say, well, because that Chinese person said this, therefore all Chinese people, or because one Jewish person said that, that doesn't mean all Jewish. So you can't generalize. And that I would, go to the Feast dialogue, guidelines for dialogue. They're quite helpful if what you're doing is a faith discussion. I think they're quite helpful ground rules to think about and consider before you start. That's all I want to say, Ali.
I've just also shared the Feast guidelines for dialogue in the chat as well, as I'm on the advisory board for the Feast, so I'm more than happy to advocate for the Feast to do some tremendous work in creating dialogue for young people.
Fantastic,
Any,
thank you.
any more questions?
There is one other question, which is about creating a comfortable and safe space. So what about the different demands of working in a physical and virtual space, which you just touched on there, actually? Maybe you'd like to speak to how we can facilitate this when we're all online, which is obviously a very different feeling.
It is very important when you're in a physical space to get the environment right. And again, I'm going to point you towards the resource that we've written for Near Neighbours about facilitating group discussions. Because, for example, the way you set out the chairs is going to make a big difference. Is it going to be really intense where people are sat really close together? Is that too intense for people? Is it going to be in a theatre style? That's not really going to encourage good discussion. Loose semicircles can be an easier way of getting people to talk. You also want the room to be warm. You want it to be comfortable. Can you provide some refreshments? Because that helps people feel relaxed, especially if before they start, give everyone a nice drink and biscuit and, So the physical space is really important to get the environment right and conducive. So how much more difficult is it in a virtual space when we're sitting on uncomfortable chairs and looking into a screen, and you don't know if people are drifting off or what they're doing? It's so hard. I have actually found even conducting webinars online is very challenging because you don't get any feedback from anybody. You don't get any verbal feedback. You don't get that physical feedback. You're sort of like projecting into an empty space. How much more difficult to try and get a conversation going, which could be quite challenging and difficult. It is really difficult because you can't read anybody's body language. You can't pick up any cues from anybody's silence or movement or, looking like they're sagging down in their seats, because you can't really tell on a virtual call. So actually, I would really rather avoid having any difficult conversations at all online, apart from perhaps with one person who you know well. For example, if you're line managing someone, it's not that difficult to line manage people online because you've got to know them, you know them well, and you can pick up kind of verbal things from seeing somebody, one person on screen. But a group dynamic is incredibly difficult to manage online. And I personally, I don't know about you, Ali, but I personally wouldn't want to conduct any really difficult conversations in a group online because I just think it's so hard. Ali, what do you think?
So for me, personally, my preference is in-person dialogue as opposed to virtual. As Liz said, having online dialogue is really tricky. Having said that, it's not impossible, but it takes a lot more crafting and a lot more utilizing it in a space where you can share openly. Again, comes back to managing outcomes and expectations. And that's really important because, again, like a webinar today, it's more of a linear process with some interaction, using Menti as a way to interact, using the chat function, using other electronic means, and that can be really powerful. However, having said that, I think online virtual connectivity and dialogue is really difficult. And this is why I totally avoid any dialogue on Israel-Palestine on social media, because it can be so polarizing. And I think that's the challenge, really, of virtual versus in person. I think even in person, having said that, it is incredibly difficult. In-person dialogue allows, you have to ensure you're reading the room, and reading the virtual room is much more difficult. And allowing and recognizing how the emotional roller coaster the participants are going on, as well as what you're going on as well. And I think that's really important as a way to guide difficult dialogue. But yes, physical, Liz mentioned lots of factors: room, seating, space, people, etc. But also knowing what kind of event dialogue you're facilitating, length of time, even. For some, to do a subject justice, you need at least 2 or 3 hours. You may not have that space and that venue available for that time. So how do you ensure you make it a series of facilitated dialogues rather than one-off singular dialogue? So again, these are all different factors to consider.
That's great, thank you. We've got 2 more questions that have come up here. Should we do one more now, and then if we've got time, we'll come back to them, because they're quite hefty subjects, I think. Okay, so this one is, how would you navigate these conversations with younger people, as sometimes it can just be repeating what they've heard or seen online and not actually their opinions?
Brilliant. I think that's young people, and I deliver a 5-day Bridge Builders program with 16 to 19-year-olds, and I love working with young people. That's just my own personal preference. So again, for me, this applies to young people as well, in the sense of it's knowing your audience, knowing where young people are at, and giving them that space to grapple, giving them that space to talk to one another. And again, this is what we do at Solutions Not Sides through our education programs, which is an opportunity for young people to have a dialogue with Palestinian and Israeli peace builders. And I think that's a good segue to introduce who we are and what we do at Solutions Not Sides as an example of how to work with young people within our particular work in an education setting. So again, what we often say is we're one very small niche part of the education space, and we work alongside a number of our partners, many of whom were mentioned here. Move on to the next slide, please. And what we do, we have 3 arms of our work. Our largest arm is our youth education program. Last academic year, we reached 6,500 young people. Last term, from September to December, which is an incredibly busy term, we reached 6,000 young people in that first term alone. So that just is a reflection on the challenge and the need for our work, but also the demand for our work as well. In addition to our youth education program, I lead on our student leadership programs, which includes a 5-day Bridge Builders program. For the last 3 years, that's been held in Cambridge in collaboration with the Wolf Institute, and that's open for 16 to 19-year-olds. I'm also been running a Model UN program, which has brought together young people from across the UK, from different schools, and the theme, or the last theme for the summit, was on creating a roadmap for peace. And I've also facilitated conferences for young people as well. In addition to our work with young people, we also provide training opportunities and resources. One of the largest areas of training that we provide provide at the moment is around recognizing and countering anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in relation to Israel-Palestine. And we have a number of resources primarily designed for the education sector in space. And what's our strategic objectives? It's to shape the next generation through education, and that's through greater empathy and humanization. It's around reducing polarization, particularly as we have seen a huge increase in polarization in society, but also an increase in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We want to nurture young people to have the ability to embrace complex narratives, to listen to the narratives rather than compelling them to agree with all narratives that they hear and listen to. We actively work towards reducing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and empowering young people to be informed citizens. Next slide, please. So our strategy is around using humanization as an approach by creating an opportunity for young people to meet an Israeli and Palestinian peace builder, listening to in-group and out-group criticism through the sharing of personal stories. Young people have the opportunity to listen to diverse narratives, embrace complexity rather than feeling threatened by it. And our speakers, particularly from the region, role model disagreeing respectfully. And that can be really powerful for young people to be able to see that being role modeled through speakers in order to be able to do it themselves as well. Our aim is to nurture critical thinking and to understand positions versus interests, and therefore leading to constructive citizenship and political activism. And we finally use a process of cognitive dissonance as a way of challenging anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Next slide, please. Our education program is a two-part program. First part is around an exploration of the history, key terms, key languages, key dates, particularly used in regards to Israel-Palestine, followed by our empowerment session, which is a 2-hour session, which allows young people to have a critical voice, to have empathy for our speakers, but then go beyond listening to personal individual stories to thinking about the needs of Israelis and Palestinians in order to better understand what are the key issues that need to be understood in order for peace to be a possibility. And young people then have the opportunity to critique and look at a one-state solution, two-state solution, confederacy model solution, and to look at what needs of Palestinians and Israelis are met through each of those solutions. Next slide, please. Just wanted to also mention some of the resources we have available, which includes Israel-Palestine, avoiding anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate speech, and the next one, which is around creating safe and compassionate spaces for learning, which again, whilst they're designed for school setting, they can be used with adult audiences as well, and empowering your education. And that's more about, there's so much disinformation and fake news out there on social media. It's really important to fact check, and we've created a list of resources that can be used in order to aid the fact checking process. Next slide, if there is one, I think. Yeah, jumping back into the questions. So yes, that was a very long-winded way, but of answering, working with young people. And in a nutshell, I think really contextualizing what you're wanting to achieve with young people is important. We have a very specific pedagogical approach in working with young people through schools and education, as well as our leadership programs. But again, one thing I will say is no one size fits all, and that approach should never be taken.
Can I just interject as well, Ali, and say I think this question was also specifically around young people. I read the question. Young people are perhaps repeating other people's views rather than having their own opinions. Perhaps they haven't got much experience, for example, and it's not always possible for us to bring someone in with personal experience of a situation. I know what's really important for your work, Ali, is you actually bring somebody who is Israeli, who is Palestinian, to speak about things from their own experience. And that's not always possible. But with young people, it's sometimes possible to get people to imagine things, for example, case studies and stories, imagining you're Brian and this has happened to you and how would you feel and so on. Film is another good way of helping young people see into a situation they don't have a lot of experience of. So, you know, showing a film of somebody and then a discussion around that. How do you think that person was dealing with it? And we've had a question as well from Humayun. How do you find common ground where people come with prejudice and trauma and so on? And again, I think it's about finding the humanity in everybody. And again, for adults, film, story, case study is a really important way, because what you want to do is people recognize you're also a person with 3 kids. You're also a person that, you know, has had a mum who was very ill in hospital, or whatever it is. Finding that link, the human link, which means that we're all part of the one human race, and we all have trauma and love and happiness and suffering, and we're all, you know, part of one human family, is the most powerful tool for helping people to dig deeper and understand someone else's situation. I'll leave it there. And we're going to hand back to Ali. And I just want to say, Ali, thanks so much for taking part today, especially since you're supposed to be on holiday in Cyprus and you make time for this.
Thank you, Liz, for having me, and thank you to my wife who's had to patiently endure me stepping out of the holiday for 90 minutes in order to be able to facilitate it as well. So again, for me, when I'm facilitating online and in person, I think checking out is really important. Of a one-word clause, and what I often say is, it can be a word, a sentence, even a paragraph. But I will ask to avoid any dissertations or essays, just for the sake of time. This is a lot more difficult to facilitate online than it is in person. But it also allows an opportunity for everybody to have a voice who may not have had the opportunity to speak as well. So we're going to use the chat function. So before you all disappear and escape, in the last few minutes, I'd just like you to answer the question of how was it for you? As a word, as a sentence, as a paragraph even. But yes, please no dissertations or essays. And Amy, Liz, whilst people are typing in, how was today for you?
I was very relieved that your Wi-Fi worked, Ellie.
I was equally relieved as well.
And I just think it's been a really helpful session. And I think the example of one of the most difficult conversations at the moment for us, Israel-Palestine, has been a helpful insight for people, I hope. And the corresponding issue around North Ireland, the north of Ireland, however you want to say it, has been also, I think, quite a helpful thing. And I just hope people have taken some tools and skills and, you know, found it encouraging.
Yeah, likewise. Glad you've been able to stay with us on the call, Ali. And yeah, I've certainly taken away a few things that I'm going to try using in my own facilitation spaces going forward. So thank you.
I'm equally relieved that we managed to get through the whole 90 minutes without any major technical hiccups. It has to be a first. I must add, I even have technical issues when I'm at home. So doing it from Cyprus, from the north, without having any major technical issues has been quite an achievement and one to write up for the future. So yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It is hitting 5:30, and as Liz said, it is really important for that timekeeping and being able to hold that space and starting on time, but also finishing on time, not to take up more time, and respecting and valuing that time that everybody's had in coming into today as well. So really appreciate everybody spending their time with us for the last 90 minutes. Have a lovely afternoon, and we'll hopefully be in touch. I have shared my email address, so feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk further.
Thanks, Ellie, as always. Cheers.
And that's all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye,
Take care
everyone.
now.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.